There's something sacred about wide open land, untouched by the rules and noise of modern life. That's why I bought the ranch in the first place, a stretch of peaceful countryside far removed from the HOA-run suburbs and their endless regulations. I'd spent years saving up, dreaming of a place where I could breathe freely, wake up to the sound of birds instead of traffic, and not have to explain myself to nosy neighbors armed with clipboards. This ranch was my reward. Fenced and legally marked, it stood proudly just outside the edge of a new development, a gated community with strict codes, glossy lawns, and a homeowners association that prided itself on control. I'd heard of HOA horror stories before. People fined for the color of their mailbox or the length of their grass, but that world didn't apply to me. My ranch was private land, and according to county records, had nothing to do with the HOA or its jurisdiction. I never thought I'd have to defend that freedom from anyone, until she showed up. She wore power like a badge, every word laced with superiority. Karen Whitmore, president of the HOA, introduced herself like she was visiting a delinquent tenant rather than stepping onto a stranger's private land. At first I tried to be polite. I assumed she was lost or curious. But it didn't take long for me to realize she was here on a mission, one that didn't care much for property lines or legal boundaries. When I denied her access to my land, things got ugly fast, and before I knew it, she'd called the cops. This is the story of how one woman's obsession with control turned into a war she couldn't win, and how standing my ground changed everything. It was a quiet Thursday morning when I first saw her. The sun had barely climbed over the hills, casting long golden streaks across the dew-covered pasture. I was out checking the south fence, sipping coffee from a metal thermos, when a sleek white SUV rolled up the dirt path leading to my gate. That was odd in itself. Nobody used that road unless they had a reason. I watched as the vehicle came to a stop just outside the entrance, the engine still humming. Then she stepped out. She was dressed in business casual, like she'd walked straight out of a boardroom. Pale blue blouse, dark slacks, low heels that looked completely out of place on gravel. Her hair was neatly styled in a blonde bob, and she carried a leather folder tucked under one arm like it was a shield. Even from a distance, I could sense she wasn't here for a neighborly chat. She scanned the property with narrowed eyes, then made her way to the gate with the air of someone arriving to conduct an audit, not pay a visit. "Good morning," she said, flashing a tight smile. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." She held out a hand, but didn't seem surprised when I kept both of mine on my thermos. I nodded, cautious but polite. "Nice to meet you. This here's private land, not part of Willow Creek." She didn't flinch. "Yes, I'm aware. But your property borders ours, and the HOA has a responsibility to ensure that surrounding areas align with community standards. We've had some concerns raised by residents." That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. I raised an eyebrow. "Concerns? About what?" "Well," she said, flipping open her folder. "There's the matter of fence uniformity, visible livestock from certain lots, and your outbuildings not matching the visual code our community prefers. It creates an inconsistency that some feel reduces property value." I stared at her, genuinely speechless for a moment. "Ma'am, this land has been a ranch for over 50 years. It doesn't fall under any HOA jurisdiction. You can't just walk in here and demand I change my fence or hide my animals." She smiled again, thinner this time. "Sometimes the law lags behind what's best for a community. We believe cooperation is in everyone's best interest. Perhaps if I could come in and take a closer look, we could—" "No," I said firmly. "You're not coming onto my land. You don't have any right." Her eyes hardened, the smile disappeared completely. "Well," she said, snapping her folder shut, "I had hoped we could resolve this peacefully, but I suppose some people need firmer reminders of what's acceptable." She turned on her heel and walked briskly back to her car, gravel crunching underfoot. I stood there watching the dust rise behind her SUV as it sped back toward the gated community. I had no idea what she meant by firmer reminders, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. 3 days passed before I saw her again. This time, I was mending a water trough near the west pasture when I noticed her SUV parked halfway on the shoulder of the main road. Karen stood outside the gate, arms folded, eyes fixed on me like a hawk sizing up prey. I didn't go to her right away. I finished tightening the valve, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked over slowly. She didn't speak until I was only a few feet from the fence. "I gave you time to reconsider," she said, her voice clipped and rehearsed. I leaned against the wooden post. "Reconsider what, exactly?" Her jaw clenched slightly. "Your refusal to allow HOA inspection. I'm here today with final notice. If you won't voluntarily allow an assessment, I'll escalate the matter to the board." I chuckled, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was beginning to feel unreal. "Karen, you don't have a board that can touch me. My property isn't inside your community, your district, or your jurisdiction. This ranch is independently zoned, and I've got every deed and legal document to prove it." She blinked, a little thrown off, but quickly recovered. "We'll see what the county says. I've already submitted a request for records. If your fences or structures violate regional codes—" "They don't," I said, cutting her off. "I checked before I bought the land. Everything is up to date. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because my barn offends your HOA aesthetic." Her expression soured. "It's not about aesthetics, it's about harmony, about maintaining value and order." "No, it's about control," I replied calmly, "and I'm not giving you any here." She stepped closer to the gate, close enough that I could see her cheeks flush red. "Do you know how many times I've had to clean up after irresponsible landowners? The people who think they're above the rules always end up being the biggest threat to the neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. "A threat? You think this ranch is a threat?" "To the environment of our community, yes," she snapped, "and I intend to fix that." I took a step back, no longer feeling polite. "You set foot beyond that gate without a court order, and it'll be trespassing. I'll call the sheriff myself." She stared at me for a long moment, then smiled in a way that made my stomach twist. "You'll regret being difficult," she said quietly. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car, heels clicking against the dirt road like hammer strikes. I watched her drive away, wondering how deep her delusion really ran. There was something about her, the way she believed her authority extended past her boundaries, that told me this wouldn't be the last time I'd see her. And I wasn't wrong. I just didn't expect how far she'd go. It started subtly at first, like a trickle before a flood. A white envelope appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the Willow Creek HOA emblem. I almost laughed when I opened it. Inside was a printed letter filled with legal-sounding nonsense about unauthorized livestock enclosures and non-conforming architectural structures. It listed my wooden shed, the barbed wire fence, and even the placement of my hay bales as violations. None of it made sense because none of it applied, but the tone was clear: comply or else. I tossed the letter in a drawer, chalking it up to Karen's bluster. But the next week, another letter arrived, then two more, each more insistent than the last. She even included photographs taken from the edge of the property, like she was building a case. There was a shot of my chicken coop at sunrise, another of my pasture fence where it dipped slightly near the creek, and one of my old tractor covered with a tarp. Each photo had red circles drawn around supposed violations. I felt more amused than threatened, but I couldn't help noticing how determined she was. She wasn't giving up, she was escalating. Then, one afternoon, I caught her standing just outside the property line with a man I didn't recognize. He wore a landscaping uniform and carried measuring tools. I watched from the porch as she gestured toward the trees lining the fence, pointing and making notes on her clipboard. I walked down, not bothering to hide my frustration. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I asked. Karen didn't even flinch. "These trees overhang into HOA visual lines. According to our guidelines, we have the right to request trimming to preserve sight lines and curb uniformity." "They're on my property," I said firmly. "Your guidelines don't apply here." She gave me that tight smile again. "When trees affect the visual harmony of Willow Creek, they become a shared concern. It's nothing personal." I stepped in front of the landscaper. "You step onto this land, I'll consider it trespassing. That includes your hired help." The landscaper looked at her, then back at me, Clearly uncomfortable, he backed away toward his truck. Karen, however, stood her ground. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." "No," I said. "You are." She didn't argue. She just turned and left again, muttering something under her breath about calling the board. That night, I installed more signage. Bold red letters on white. Private property. No trespassing. I added trail cameras near the tree line and reinforced the gates with fresh locks. I wasn't paranoid. I was being prepared, because something told me this wasn't over. For Karen, this wasn't just about rules or trees. It was about control, and she couldn't stand that I wasn't falling in line. The war had started, and her demands were only the beginning. The next morning, I drove straight to the county clerk's office and requested every legal document tied to my property. Plat maps, zoning declarations, historical records, everything. I wasn't just trying to prove a point. I was arming myself for what I knew was coming. I spent the rest of the day organizing those papers into a thick binder and left copies with my lawyer. I didn't want any doubt hanging in the air about who had the legal right to this land. Karen wanted a fight, and I was going to give her one, but by the book. The following week, I received another letter from the Willow Creek HOA, this time more aggressive. It threatened legal action and claimed I was in violation of community environmental standards. I was apparently contributing to visual pollution and livestock disturbances that disrupted the peace of the neighboring homes. It was laughable. I didn't even have a rooster. My cattle were quieter than the golf carts buzzing around their cul-de-sacs. But this wasn't about noise. It was about me not doing what she wanted. I responded with a cease and desist letter drafted by my lawyer and delivered it directly to the HOA's office. I also informed the sheriff's department about the ongoing harassment and made sure everything was logged in case Karen tried to cross the line. Sheriff Davis, a man I'd known for years, assured me he'd keep an eye on the situation. He'd heard stories about overreaching HOA presidents before, but this one, he said, seemed extra determined. Karen didn't take the warning well. 2 days later, I spotted new flyers posted on the community bulletin board outside the gated entrance. "Preserving our standards, a call for action," it read. Beneath it was a picture of my ranch taken from the road, captioned with words like unaesthetic, hazardous, and non-compliant. She was stirring up her residents, framing me as a rogue outsider, ruining their perfect neighborhood. That same evening, a couple from the neighborhood showed up at my gate. They looked uncomfortable but said they'd been told to encourage cooperation. I thanked them politely, told them the truth about my land, and watched as their confusion turned into embarrassment. It was clear Karen wasn't just overstepping, she was manipulating. I doubled down, added 2 more signs, bought solar-powered cameras for the back pasture, and reinforced the fencing along the northern edge. I wasn't about to be bullied off land I owned fair and square. This ranch was my home, my peace, my freedom, and I wasn't letting some power-hungry HOA president strip that away because my barn didn't match her idea of harmony. She wanted a showdown, and she was pushing hard to get it. But I wasn't moving. I wasn't bending. I stood my ground, and I could feel her frustration growing louder than any legal notice. Something was coming. I could feel it in the air like a storm just beyond the ridge. It was a Saturday afternoon when I noticed several cars pull up along the edge of the gravel road that bordered my ranch. They parked in a tidy row, like they were attending some formal event. 5 people stepped out dressed in collared shirts and khakis, each carrying clipboards or notepads. Leading the group, of course, was Karen, her walk brisk, her expression tight with purpose. She wasn't alone this time. She brought backup. They didn't try to open the gate. Instead, they fanned out along the fence line, pointing and murmuring among themselves like inspectors at a construction site. One of them took photos of my barn from across the road. Another jotted notes furiously as Karen gestured toward my fencing, the animal pens, and even the windmill. I stayed back by the porch, arms crossed, watching the little performance unfold. Karen didn't speak to me at first. She kept her focus on the so-called assessment, pretending I wasn't standing right there, witnessing it all. When she finally approached, it was with a white envelope in hand and a condescending smile that barely hid her irritation. "This is your final notice," she said. The HOA has reviewed the situation and determined that your property presents a long-term visual and environmental conflict with the Willow Creek community. I didn't take the envelope. I let her hand hang in the air. This land isn't under your HOA, I said. It never was, and it never will be. You and your little board don't have any power here. Her smile dropped. We'll be filing a formal complaint with the county, and if you continue to obstruct... I raised a hand. Go ahead. You'll be laughed out of the courthouse. I've got maps, deeds, and every document I need to prove you're wasting everyone's time. The other members behind her shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding my gaze. One of the men cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing to recheck the boundary lines. Karen shot him a glare, then turned back to me. This isn't over. I gave her a half smile. It is for you. She stormed off, muttering under her breath again. The others followed, a little slower, a little less certain. As their cars disappeared down the road, I felt a strange mix of tension and satisfaction. She'd made her move, and it had landed like a pebble thrown at a mountain. But I knew Karen. She wasn't done yet, not even close. It was early evening when I heard the tires crunching on gravel. I looked up from the barn to see red and blue lights flashing against the trees. A county sheriff's cruiser was pulling up just beyond the front gate. I wiped my hands on my jeans, already knowing who had made the call, and sure enough, there she was. Karen Whitmore, standing beside the cruiser like she'd just delivered the town's most important emergency. The deputy stepped out, adjusted his belt, and approached the fence. Evening, he said, calm and measured. We got a call about a disturbance. Mind if I have a word? I nodded and walked over. No problem, deputy. What seems to be the issue? Before he could speak, Karen chimed in, her voice sharp and urgent. This man has been violating several community regulations and refusing to comply with requests for access. I have documentation of unapproved structures and potential safety hazards. Ma'am, the deputy interrupted. I'll speak to you in a moment. She looked stunned but took a few steps back, clearly irritated that her authority didn't carry weight here. The deputy turned back to me. Sir, she claims there have been code violations and aggressive behavior. I held out the thick folder I'd prepared weeks ago. I've got all my property records, county zoning confirmation, and a cease and desist letter from my lawyer. This land is privately owned and not subject to her HOA. She's been harassing me for weeks. The deputy took the folder, flipped through a few pages, and gave a slow nod. Everything looks in order here. You're right. This parcel is outside HOA jurisdiction. There's nothing she can enforce. I watched Karen's face twist as the deputy turned to her. Ma'am, unless you have a warrant or a legitimate county complaint, you need to leave. If you continue to show up uninvited, you'll be facing a trespassing charge. She started to protest, but the deputy raised a hand. This isn't a matter for your board. It's private land. Let it go. With a huff, she turned and stormed back to her SUV without another word. The deputy gave me a nod, handed back the folder, and left quietly. I stood there for a moment as the cruiser disappeared down the road. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight start to lift, but I knew even then that her pride had taken a hit she wouldn't forget. And people like Karen? They don't go down without a final swing. It didn't take long for word to spread around Willow Creek. The day after the deputy shut Karen down, a neighbor from the gated community stopped by. He was an older gentleman named Mr. Rayburn, soft-spoken, polite, and clearly uncomfortable. He stood just beyond the gate, holding a manila folder and shifting from foot to foot, like he wasn't sure he should even be there. I met him halfway, curious but cautious. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. I just thought you might want to see this. He handed me the folder and explained that he was on the HOA advisory committee, though he rarely participated, until now. Apparently, Karen had been going around the neighborhood claiming she was working on a special HOA expansion project. She told residents that extending their influence over adjacent properties, including mine, would boost property values and bring visual order to the area. Most people didn't question her. They trusted her title, her confidence, her pitch. But a few began to wonder when she started requesting additional HOA dues for legal initiatives. Inside the folder were copies of internal emails, board meeting notes, and complaints filed by residents. One note in particular stood out. It was an email from Karen to a private developer, proposing that if the HOA could pressure neighbouring properties to fall in line, it would make the area more appealing for a future retail investment. That was her endgame. It had nothing to do with trees or fences. It was about money, power, and a long-term land grab dressed up as community service. By the end of that week, a special meeting was called by the board. Several residents showed up with concerns and demanded answers. When Karen tried to defend herself, citing visionary leadership, the board wasn't buying it. The documents did all the talking. Within days, she was removed as HOA president. Her influence evaporated faster than it had taken her to print those first violation letters. As for me, I didn't hear from her again. The mailbox stayed empty, the road stayed quiet, and the ranch, my ranch, went back to being the peaceful refuge it had always been. Truth has a funny way of coming out when you least expect it. And sometimes, all you have to do is stand your ground and wait. The days that followed were the quietest I'd had in months. The tension that had wrapped itself around the ranch like barbed wire finally unraveled. No more unwanted visits, no more strange cars parked along the road, just the sound of wind moving through the trees, the soft hum of livestock, and the rhythm of the land returning to normal. For a while I'd forgotten what peace felt like, but now it was back, and it tasted even sweeter knowing I'd earned it. Looking back, the strangest part of the whole ordeal wasn't Karen's arrogance or even her relentless persistence. It was the way she truly believed she was right. In her mind, there was no boundary she couldn't cross if she believed it was for the good of the community. That kind of mindset is dangerous, especially when it comes wrapped in official titles and neighborhood newsletters. The truth is, power, no matter how small, can twist people. Give someone a title and a clipboard, and suddenly they think they're the law. But I learned something too. I learned that standing up for your space, your freedom, isn't just about fences and legal documents. It's about knowing where you draw the line and refusing to be pushed beyond it, no matter how much pressure comes your way. I could have given in. I could have trimmed the trees, painted the barn, or let her take a stroll through my property just to keep the peace. But then it wouldn't have been my land anymore. It would have been hers in spirit, even if not on paper. Now, when I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sun dip behind the hills, I know I didn't just protect a piece of property. I protected something deeper. My right to live how I choose. My right to peace. And perhaps, in a strange way, I should thank Karen for reminding me just how important that is. The ranch is still here, the grass still grows wild, the animals still graze where they please, and me, I'm still standing exactly where I was, only stronger and a whole lot wiser.